ideas. What you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Hey everyone, I want to share with you a new AI-powered research tool I've been using to find scientific papers and learn from the literature. It's called Consensus. It is an AI-powered search tool built using large language models trained to help you find and understand the best science faster. Consensus helps you not only find individual papers, but its AI models will help you assess research quality and even synthesize insights across multiple papers for you. You can ask it general questions about any topic you might have, such as what are the known risks and benefits of a certain prescription drug? What do we know about how a certain food or nutrient affects the human body? Anything you can think of. Its Pro Analysis feature will actually provide you with a concise, written summary of what the literature says, broken down point by point, highlighting the strength of the evidence across papers, and providing you with individual studies ranked by the relevance and including additional information like citation rates, journal quality, and more. You can also save, cite, and share individual studies with a single click. Unlike other AI and search tools like ChatGPT, PubMed, or Google Scholar, Consensus uses over 20 custom large language models that are developed and trained for this specific purpose. The base Consensus product is totally free, but the premium product that you can subscribe to has better features and unlimited queries. And I highly recommend this if you are using outdated tools like PubMed or Google Scholar, or you just do your own research. For a limited time, you can use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL, all one word, to get a free premium subscription for 1 year. That is a $150 value for free if you use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL today. So click the link in the episode description or check my support page and give Consensus a try. Use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL to unlock your free premium subscription today. Chatters, do you guys just want to take a minute to introduce yourselves and tell everyone a little bit about what you guys do and what you study?
Sure. I'm Ben Potter. I'm a professor of anthropology up at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And my research mainly is in Beringian archaeology, but I'm very interested in the peopling of the Americas. And I've written on the archaeology and the genetics relating to that.
And I'm Jim Chatters. I'm an archaeologist and paleontologist working out of the Seattle area in Washington. I'm also secondarily affiliated with McMaster University, where I serve on doctoral committees.
And so you guys have, we're going to talk about a recent paper, but also how that hooks into, I think, a more general and wide-ranging body of work that you guys are a part of to do with human prehistory. And I think much of what we'll talk about here is essentially the human prehistory of North America, how people got into North America, what they were doing when they were there, who they were, and all that stuff. The new paper you talked about focused in a lot on what people were eating in that time, which is a fascinating subject, and it connects into a lot of stuff that I cover on the podcast, including diet, metabolism, what people eat and what the metabolic consequences of that are. But the sample that you work with on this new paper is from something called a Clovis person, someone who lived during this Clovis period of history. Can one of you just give us a brief overview of what was the Clovis culture? What time period are we talking about here? And what are the sort of just the broad strokes of what we know about those people?
You want to take that one, Ben?
No, go for it, Jim. You're
okay.
More closely associated.
Oh, right. Down here south of the ice. Yeah. Clovis is the first and really the only continent-wide cultural manifestation that we see in the Americas, in North America. And it extends from the southern margin of the glacial ice, so in parts of southern Canada, all the way down to northern Venezuela. It is characterized by large trianguloid fluted spear points, that is with a hafting groove, large knives, bifacial knives, end scrapers with little spurs on the edges of them for grooving bone. And it's also frequently found with large bone, ivory, or antler foreshafts. It's seen frequently in association with mammoth remains at kill sites. Mammoth bones are easy to see. People find them, they get excited because they're bigger than modern animals, and so mammoth kills are frequently reported. And there are 14 of these known. But it's also found as scattered spear points throughout the eastern United States. And a few small campsites have been found, very ephemeral campsites where people stayed for a very brief period of time, maybe a few weeks at most, before moving on. So it's a highly mobile, what appears to be hunting-based culture. Dates between roughly, depending on who you ask, between 11,400 and 12,700 years ago, in that range.
I see. So we're talking about 11 to 12,000 years ago, give or take. And these people were basically all over the Americas, a very large extent, and they shared sort of a common culture in terms of like the tools and the artifacts and the lifestyle they seem to be leading.
Yes, very much the same sort of thing everywhere you see them. But they're between 12,700 and 13,400 years.
I see. And
a little bit older.
Is it thought that these are likely to be, this was like the first culture, the first peoples to actually get into the Americas, or is that debated, or what's going on there?
Been a matter of debate.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think we have time here to nuance it, so that's great because the media sometimes latches onto a number or a site.
Mm-hmm.
So when Jim mentioned this is the first widespread cultural manifestation, this is what we'd expect to see for a colonizing, very rapid spread of people in a very short window of time, as Jim mentioned. And the toolkits are very homogeneous. They look the same wherever we find them.
Mm-hmm.
And that really does speak of a colonizing population, roughly 13.5. Some people argue is, later, like maybe 13.1, 13,100, but certainly a narrow window. So the question then is, do these represent the first Native Americans that are the ancestors that are entering the region? And here we have to sort of look at the genetics as well as the archaeology. And from what we can tell, there's three major branches of Native American ancestry. The first two of them don't matter as much because they're in the far north. So ancient Beringians are the ones that I normally deal with up here in Beringia. And they never really got further south than, say, the Yukon Territory. So they remained in Beringia, north of the ice sheets. The Northern Native American group, NNA, is what they're called. That's a metapopulation that seemed to remain in the Northwest coast. So basically Puget Sound north into sort of British Columbia coast and Alaska coast. And those people, we don't really find them further south. These would be ancestors of Algonquians, Dene people like Athabascans and Tlingit, Salishan, folks like that. Of course, at the very end of the record, we see, a later movement south of Navajo and Apache ancestors, but we clearly know they're coming from the north. So that leaves the main clade or the main metapopulation, which we term South Native Americans or SNA. And that's basically the ancestors of every Native American sort of south of Canada. So all the rest of North America, Mesoamerica, and all of South America. And when we look at the individuals that are linked with this genetic group, the Anzac individual is, of course, the earliest. It's the very first one we have. And every other ancient remain we have, Spirit Cave, Lagoa Santa, people in further South America, they're all part of sublineages of this SNA group. So really, we're looking at the peopling of this SNA group. And genetically, sort of the diversification within that is somewhere between 14.8 and 12.8. So 14,800 and 12,800, which does map on really nicely to when we see this Clovis phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And so then there's two questions, do these represent the earliest peoples? I think as Jim mentioned, there's not firm consensus. A lot of folks, I think many of our colleagues agree that this is probably the case, but there's probably a smattering of earlier materials that are probably the direct ancestors. Genetically, we know that these early SNA groups are very small, so maybe a single founding population of maybe 200 individuals. You're not going to see that archaeologically right away. It's going to take some time before they build up. So
Hmm.
some of these sites, perhaps Monteverde, perhaps Page Latson, if these are connected, associated directly with secure dates, those could represent, Clovis ancestors, certainly. And we really only find them at enough numbers at around this 13,000 year period. And then there's the other argument for maybe really early sites like, White Sands, footprints, the Cooper's Ferry site. There's a few sites that are out there that have been argued to be older than 15 or 16,000.
Hmm.
And I think definitely the jury is out on all of
Hmm.
those. Don't seem to map on genetically with what we understand. And I think White Sands might prove to be the most secure at this point, maybe 22,000. And that's a time period when we know Native American ancestors are still admixing with other groups in Asia.
Hmm.
But we don't know who those people are if the dates are secure. So it's a
Hmm.
complicated question, but
Yeah.
Clovis is really important in this debate.
Yeah. But I think bird's eye view here, if I'm understanding correctly, no matter what the specific answer to the question of who were the very, very first people to get into the Americas, at some point, there were these people that had a certain culture that's referred to as a Clovis culture. And you start to see that everywhere in the, from northern North America all the way down into South America over a relatively short period of time, which implies that there was some kind of, at some point, some kind of fast radiation outwards, such that they all retain the same culture because they presumably inherited that from a common ancestor. And so the Clovis people sort of spread very quickly throughout the Americas, starting at some point. Perhaps they were the first people, and there were more ephemeral populations of their ancestors there, a little bit here, a little bit there before that. Perhaps other people were around. Maybe there's some debate on that. But at some point, this Clovis culture kind of spreads very quickly.
Right. There are really only a couple of possibilities here, um, given the widespread distribution of Clovis. One is there was nobody else there to begin with, so they
Yeah.
are the first.
Mm-hmm.
Or if there was somebody there already, they had a completely different ecological niche.
Mm.
So it was possible for this expanding mammoth hunting Clovis population to enter their landscape, their regions without competing with them,
Mm.
and therefore capable of moving in without any impediment. Those are really the only viable two possibilities there, and the latter would, as Ben was pointing out, require that we had some previously existing genetic population that no longer exists.
Mm. So, I mean, it's a formal possibility, but what we lack that kind of evidence that would definitively show that.
Right, right. The possible archaeological manifestations that could predate Clovis, or what we recognize as Clovis, are not very much older than Clovis.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and and they, in the case of, say, like the Wally's Beach site in southern Alberta, where there are horse and camel kills, definitely human killed animals with artifacts left behind with the bones. We don't find spear points with those, but those might just be the earliest Clovis populations.
Mm.
So some of these other ones, Ben mentioned Monteverde. I don't think Monteverde is a possibility. It's way too far south to have been part of this. If it isn't a rapidly expanding population like Clovis, it's not going to make it to South America that fast if it's part of that
Mm.
same genetic group. What we see in South America instead is we see a culture that is clearly Clovis derived, called the fishtail complex. The spear points are like Clovis points, only they have a waist. And those appear in South America, and when they start appearing, you can see their numbers increasing in frequency as the number of species, as the now extinct species decline. It's just a complete opposite directions they're going.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, it's pretty clear that people are coming in as Clovis-derived populations probably after around 13,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And so, is the idea here that these people walked over from Asia over what is today it would be the land bridge that connects present day Russia to Alaska, and they came in through that route?
Yeah, so there's certainly debate as to routes, and our paper doesn't speak to either route. It doesn't really matter. the point is, at some point, whether they came through an ice-free corridor or whether they came along the coast, eventually they got to the Americas south of the ice sheet, and that's where our story takes over. And the relevance to sort of the peopling part of this is that our data now, for the first time, we have direct evidence of what their economy was like. Before we just had indirect evidence, and we can talk about that. This fits into pretty elegant models for the nature of this lifeway, this nature of this adaptation that allowed people, modern humans, to expand into these very far northern regions, make it to Beringia across the land bridge. East-west is not a problem. It's the north that becomes an issue. How do you take mid-latitude adapted peoples and then have them survive in the far north, which is much more difficult. And then they took this strategy, which included proboscidean hunting, through Alaska, and then we see them, in this Clovis population. So it does allow us to begin to explore and explicate the nature of this adaptation, how they became so successful, because this was a very successful adaptation, a very successful colonization event, which led to all of the Native Americans, the many millions that have had successful heritages sort of just through the millennia.
Mm-hmm. And so remind us too, in terms of the big timeline here, is this time period that we're talking about, is this still considered the ice age, or is this the tail end of the ice age? And how far is the ice going across this period?
This is the tail end of the ice age. The deglaciation begins about 16,000 years ago and increases in its speed of melt. And the glaciers are pretty much gone throughout all but the northern parts of Canada, northeastern Keewatin, by around 12,000 years ago. Majority of the ice is gone. Okay. So it's a fairly rapid melt off. And the argument has been there are two ice masses. One is the continental ice, and the other is the Cordilleran ice. So one is coming off the Canadian Shield, and the other off the Western Mountains. And as one moves east and the other west, they coalesce in what is now Alberta, up into the Yukon. And the question is, when did those two ice masses separate enough that human populations could pass down between them? And those who suggest that people entered the Americas by way of the Pacific coast, for which, by the way, there is thus far no actual evidence, that they either passed through the Pacific coast because they don't think the ice between these two glaciers had separated enough for populations to move down between. So when did the ice-free corridor open up enough that people could enter? Mm-hmm. Is the big question. And I think Ben probably has a better handle on what the current thinking on that is, what the most recent dates are on that.
Yeah, so that's there's still debate. It hasn't been resolved. The early estimates are something along the lines of 15,000. This would be passable, and we have plants. We have sand dunes that are activated. Certainly impossible if it's under ice or under periglacial lakes. Others have argued that it's more restrictive. Maybe it's 12,600 or so. So obviously this is a really important debate because Clovis we see generating roughly around 13,000, a little bit before. I think most models would be fine with Clovis going through the ice-free corridor, even the skeptics. But the issue is, what about these early sites? And you can see the issue. It depends on which early site you think is a clear association. Those that think that they're not that good, there's no problem. Those that think, wow, the 16,000-year-old site is a legitimate, then there's the issue of, the corridor might not be passable yet. So it's all tied to the scattering of, and I'll just have to say, very different sites with very different levels of evidence. None of them link with each other, and none of them link with later peoples. There's always going to be debate. They're not really, they're not unequivocal. And so that's ultimately, it doesn't matter for our purposes because this is a successful, and it's a successful expansion with Clovis, clearly genetically linked with later peoples, with all later peoples. So it makes this, the research that we just published, important at a number of different levels to look at this lifeway. Periglacial hunting of large mammals, megafauna, very near ice, This is what we clearly see in Siberia. We clearly see it in Beringia, and now we see it in Montana, or what was ancient
Hmm.
Montana almost 13,000 years ago.
In fact,
Yeah.
you can see it all the way east into Europe,
Hmm.
going back into the Gravettian. I mean, it goes back into the um, close to 30,000 or over 30,000 years ago that people have begun hunting in paraglacial environments and killing
I
mammoths.
see.
So it's not a recent phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah. I was actually going to ask this next. So, you know, by the time you get Clovis and the paper that we're going to talk about, the predecessors of these people, the people that were already in Eurasia and other parts of the world. So it sounds like there's already evidence that they were engaged in hunting large animals and doing that type of thing in glacial or periglacial environments.
Yeah, there's really exciting research. I've been involved with a team up here at University of Alaska Fairbanks, led by Matt Wooler, where we're really trying to look at a mammoth ecology, particularly stable isotope ecology and sort of mobility with sort of strontium and oxygen and other kinds of elemental analysis. It's really interesting. So we published just earlier this year on there was an earlier male mammoth and then later female mammoth where we're taking sections along the tusk and looking at their life history. Where are they moving on the landscape? And some of the things that we found is that they're very, very mobile, managing to pretty much move across eastern Beringia, number one. Number two, there are certain areas that they like. So there's certain habitat that seem mammoth friendly. And really interestingly, those are the areas that we see the most occupation, these early pre-Clovis occupations that are clearly in secure contexts. Sites like Swan Point, dating to 14,000 over 14,000 years ago, we actually have three mammoths that were found at that site, including that's where this one female died. And so we're really getting a
Mhm.
good picture of how people can adapt to these paraglacial conditions in what we term the Arctic steppe or the mammoth steppe, where you have tundra-like plants, you have steppe-like plants into this very productive grassland ecosystem found in Northeast Asia, Siberia. It's found in Beringia, and it is found in the northern Great Plains, where we've worked on this Antic one individual. So this is an adaptation that is geared towards late glacial, relatively homogeneous sort of landscapes prior to this onset of the Holocene warming. So
Hmm.
it's an interesting and very successful adaptation.
I see. So basically, it sounds like using isotopes, and maybe we'll get into some of the methodological details a little later, but basically, there were mammoths all over the place in certain parts of the world. They were mobile. They moved around a lot, maybe not unlike present day animals of different kinds. They probably migrated from one place to another according to, what was going on from one season to the next. And it sounds like a lot of the evidence in sort of the pre-Clovis world, you guys and other people you find ephemeral human encampments, meaning it looked like people were at places for certain parts of the year or for little bits of time. And it really, what you were just saying, it sounds like they're following around animals that move around from one season to the next.
Right. The sites that we see that are associated with that are Clovis, the campsites that are Clovis, are retain very high patterning. Okay, people are there briefly. They're doing a few things within that space, and they're not occupying it long enough to change what they're doing within any of the parts of that space. And so your record is it's a very, very clean stamp of behavior
Hmm.
that's left behind. So that tells you that people were only there briefly and only once. Had they returned repeatedly to that same locality, you'd either see a sort of what we refer to as a palimpsest of different occupation events,
Mm-hmm.
breaking up the discrete patterning that you see from that first episode of occupation. You'd either see that, or you'd have stratified sequences where you have the same kind of camp there repeatedly as sedimentary processes cover up the previous camp. You're still seeing people coming back over and over again. Clovis, we don't see that. In Western Clovis, particularly, we don't see that. Any camp we see was occupied once only, and never returned to again. And so, what these fit is an idea that was put out by Bob Kelly and Larry Todd 40 years ago, and that is that Clovis people were um, moving from kill to kill.
Mm.
So the population would stay At the previous kill location, the non-mobile members of society, the children, the caregiving women, the old people, would stay behind at the last kill and continue to live off what's left of it and maybe forage around the landscape a little bit while they're waiting for uh, the able-bodied um, folks out there hunting mammoth to
Hmm.
come back and say, okay, or elk or bison or whatever they were going after, and come back and say, okay, we've got another one, and
Hmm.
so pick up and leave and go to that next spot and never come back.
Hmm.
That's the pattern we see with Clovis. It fits it. The pattern that we've been seeing since they put out that idea has continued to reinforce that interpretation.
Hmm.
And
And
we should talk about the implications of this. There's broader implications beyond just simply that's interesting about the past.
mhm,
So when we study hunter-gatherer human ecology, this is, as a species, this is 99.9% of our time on the planet has been as members of small hunter-gatherer groups. And in the recent past, we have ethnographic information. We can actually visit and look at the history, look at what they actually do on the landscape now. And we can model the success of that behavior. But when we look at maybe foragers or collectors, different kinds of models we have now, there's nothing in the recent past that matches the expectations that we see for these early peoples. And so when Kelly and Todd modeled this, when they thought about this way back when, they invented a new type, a traveler, a new kind of human ecological model that doesn't really match anything that we've got today, but obviously it had profound impacts on how we populated the planet. And so this is the importance of that particular model. It relied on megafaunal specialization. It relied on mapping onto the animals. When you
mhm,
understood their ecology, you could enter new areas. You could break biotic barriers. If you did something that would be akin to more modern foraging ecology, you're limited to a certain area. You're really, really good at getting everything you can. You're mapping onto that place, but you can't transfer that knowledge to a new place very easily. So it's a very different way of
hmm.
life that we're trying to uncover.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as animals expand their range, they typically do what's called habitat tracking. They move with the kind of habitat as their habitat expands as a consequence of climate change.
Hmm.
In this case, the habitat is the animals themselves.
Hmm.
So they're following animals that they understand moving into a new landscape they may not know with an ecosystem they're not familiar with, but the animal that they're seeking is still familiar to them. So they don't have a big learning curve as they move into that new ecosystem. So that's what allowed them to move across the continent into all sorts of different ecosystems because they were their habitat itself was mobile.
Yeah, yeah. The habitat is the animals that they're following.
Yeah, their niche was a mobile niche. I guess niche is a better word to use for in this case for ecological purposes.
Hmm.
But
And
it was moving, and they simply followed it.
yeah, and I suppose if this is all true, and it sounds like it probably is, another implication is like when you think about, for example, um, all of the Native American populations that we might talk about in history that ended up arising in North America. If what you're saying is true, Ben, what you mentioned, um, if they are descended from this type of person, it means that when we think about their diet, when we think about how they emerge and evolved, we actually can't look to other hunter-gatherer populations that are more recent, in other parts of the world as a as a map to what might be it's a map for how these people used to live and who they're descended from. This is sounds like a relatively new culture that arose that allowed people to be mobile and follow around these types of animals.
It was kind of
Well,
like an old culture.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's complicated. So part of this deals with sort of modern humans. So we're all talking about modern, anatomically modern humans with
Yeah.
just the same brains and same social complexity that we have today. So that is more like this is the ancient model that allowed for relatively small populations with very high mobility, large territory sizes. That was what was dominant in the past, in the
Mm-hmm.
last ice age. What's interesting and what's sort of the big anthropological questions today are how do we shift from that to like beginning to domesticate plants and animals?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting because you need to know what happened before to understand the context of that very new kind of tradition. And we see this independently emerge in various places in the Americas. So it's very, very exciting to understand that baseline, that that persisted for such a long time around the globe, and then these Holocene shifts. And it does tie into climate change. So when we look at sort of expectations of this global warming that we experience now, and by the way, it's much more pronounced in in the higher latitudes, up here in the Arctic. And understanding the last major time that we saw a major warming event was this period we're talking about. And for timing, the expansion of Clovis and SNA groups occurred during the Bowling Alarid period. So this was a warmer interstadial period within the Ice Age. And then at the end of it, at the end of Clovis, we see a sharp turn to more colder, arid conditions called the Younger Dryas that your readers might or listeners might be familiar with. And at the end of the Younger Dryas, that's that last gasp, and you get the expanding, warming, moisture conditions of the Holocene. So what's interesting is not just sort of this expansion in this warm period, but in the end of Clovis, basically Clovis populations begin to adapt to more local conditions right at the onset of this Younger Dryas. So there's definitely a climate signal happening for the success of this group in ways that we're still trying to disentangle now.
Yes, it's possible it's coincidence, simple coincidence that the megafauna that human beings were dependent on were becoming so depleted that they needed to focus on more local ecosystem at the same time as the Younger Dryas occurred. I mean, these are coincident. The extinctions of megafauna are occurring just before the onset of the Younger Dryas. That's where the dates tend to be coming out these days. Is not too much not too much less than 13,000 years ago is when we see this kind of cliff of megafauna populations dropping off. So around 12,007 to 12,800, we see the beginning of the Younger Dryas. And so, and at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, at the end of Clovis, is when we start seeing the local populations develop their own ways of life. In the Northeast, you have the caribou hunters. In the Great Plains, you have the bison hunters. But in the southeastern United States and in the lake country of the West, you got people who are becoming more generalized hunter-gatherers that are using a lot more plant materials and things like that. And so each region has its own Clovis descendant population doing something that adapts to the local environment.
And before we get to this period, and again, we look back at the predecessors of the Clovis culture, how long do we think people were hunting mammoths and living these very mobile lives, doing a lot of hunting? Is that like tens of thousands of years of human prehistory that we're talking about?
Yeah. So in the old world, in Eurasia, there's lots of evidence of proboscidean hunting. It's not necessarily specialization, like that's all that they did, but it was a wide suite of megafauna that clearly could be exploited by and were exploited by modern humans, and also Neanderthals. Mention them. So this is a very, very, very long-term adaptation to megafaunal hunting in northerly areas. And this, of course, is long before we've got evidence of domestication or use, widespread use of plants, that sort of thing. So broadly, when we talk about, a Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, this is one of those adaptations that we're really speaking about. Is this focus on what we would term ecologically the highest ranked animals on the landscape. And in terms of your diet, you're going to choose the animals that give the most return for the energy that you're putting out. So this would be measured like in kilocalories, for instance. And when those animals are abundant enough and your human population is low enough, right, carrying capacity is such that you can basically make those animals effectively. That's the animals you should be choosing, and that's what we see. That's what we see evidence of. So I can say for our paper as a segue, this wasn't necessarily surprising to us working on it because we work on sites that have these animal remains in those sites and the megafauna predominate. But there are naysayers. There are people that argue, well, maybe the big bones survive, the small bones don't. So maybe it's just taphonomy. Like maybe they were foragers, or they look at modern ecosystems. Well, really, humans couldn't live in the Great Basin, for instance, and just live on megafauna. They must have been incorporating lots of smaller game, fish, birds, small mammals, things like that. So the arguments were always secondary. Right? We had indirect, even arguments about the spear points couldn't possibly penetrate a mammoth hide. Of course, relying on woolly mammoth as opposed to Columbian mammoth, which were more likely the targets. And then other researchers a year later saying, here's tons of ballistic evidence and other kinds of data that showed that in fact was an effective weapon against proboscidean. So you had this sort of debate, but from my perspective, it's the multiple lines of evidence that are the strongest, and we had multiple lines of evidence sort of pointing to this, but we didn't have that direct data, and this is what our article provided.
So it sounds like, at a high level at least, there's probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years of human evolutionary history, especially at more northern latitudes, where human beings were doing a lot of harvesting of ecologically high ranked animals. So, large animals probably competing with, or even potentially even stealing from apex predators, and eating a lot of animal products, especially at those more northern latitudes.
Right.
Well, there's some debate in Beringia, and that's the area that I work in.
And remind us what exactly, what area is that precisely?
Yeah, Beringia encompasses that area right now, includes Alaska. It includes Yukon Territory, basically the areas not covered by glaciers further south. It includes the Bering Strait, which is now underwater, and also the easternmost point of Russia, so Chukotka, Kamchatka, that region, and broadly between the Verkhoyansk Mountains, the Kolyma River in Asia, and in the Mackenzie River in North America, that's Beringia. So it's effectively its own subcontinent. The land bridge, people say, it's a kind of a bad term. You think you might fall off the bridge. It's actually 1,000 miles north and south. It's a landmass that connects our part of the world with Asia, Alaska. And so, like with Swan Point, for instance, where we have 3 individuals of mammoth, including baby mammoth ribs, which clearly are not scavenged, they're hunted and brought to the site. We also have waterfowl. We also have evidence of other kinds of resources that were being exploited in the far north. A recent paper, we've identified salmon fishing happening around 13,000, basically at Clovis times. So Beringia is a little bit different. They're certainly utilizing a wide range along with the megafauna. The question is always to what extent. Like you can say a lot.
Yeah,
that's not effective.
Yeah.
We would like percentages, and that's one of the things that Jim and I and our team brought out of this particular paper is we can put numbers on things.
Yeah. So I guess what you're implying there is, there's been a lot of debate over the years in terms of, okay, well, chimpanzees will hunt and kill things when they can find them. The question is, how often can they do this? So obviously people were eating meat to some extent. They were probably eating berries whenever they could find them to some extent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The questions have really been like, okay, were these earlier humans, were they essentially hyper carnivores that were specializing in meat eating? Were they still largely omnivorous, even if they were eating quite a bit of meat, and so on and so forth? That's sort of some of the context here.
A lot of it has to do with the habitat you're living in. People who are living in the tropics where there's a lot of fruit available, even as Homo sapiens are likely taking advantage of that abundance. When you move up into the Mammoth Steppe, which stretched from Europe all the way to the northern Great Plains in North America, you don't have a lot of plant materials that are edible for you. Unless you're going to be trying to exploit tiny little grass seeds, which makes very, very little sense for a mobile population to be trying to do. Your main food supply is going, and the majority of the biomass that is edible for you at any one time is going to be megafaunal. If you're not exploiting the megafauna, you're not going to be eating very much.
Yeah. It seems pretty commonsensical to me. But I think what you were saying earlier speaks to that. You're just saying if you the further north you go, if you just look at where the calories are located in the environment, you're going to have a really hard time efficiently extracting those calories from your environment unless you are doing quite a bit of hunting of megafauna as you go further north.
Right. We don't eat sagebrush and we don't eat grass, and that's mostly what was in there. And we don't eat birch and baby spruces and things like that, which makes up the rest of the steppe. So if you're not focused on that fauna, then you're not going to be having much food supply.
So sorry to interrupt. One of the elements that make the story so compelling, I think, to a number of the media and the public in general, is there's lots of other elements that this ties into about method. Just how do we do archaeology? How can we tell what ancient people actually, what their economies were like?
Hmm.
And for instance, there's a debate that was just published last year about association, like what's the relationship between kill sites we'd expect to see relative to exploitation of animals and their abundance on the environment. And there were two sides that really argued with the same data, different conclusions. There's
Hmm.
not enough kill sites to show megafaunal specialization. Oh, there are enough kill sites, even more than we expect to see, to show this association of megafaunal specialization. So this tells you that we're an evolving field, that this data can really provide evidence that can be helpful for archaeologists everywhere to be thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of each kind of evidence and each type of evidence, and that we should be careful with our models and a little bit more um, sort of tied to empirical reality when we can.
Hmm. So if we get into the recent paper, so the title of it, which people can look up, I'll link to it and everything. It's Mammoth featured heavily in Western Clovis diet. So the punchline is right there in the title. Let's really unpack this for people. So when we talk about the Western Clovis diet, before this paper came out, what was sort of the thinking or the debate of what could be true in terms of what these people were eating?
Well, the argument was between were Clovis people uh, megafauna specialists? Were they hunting specialists?
Hmm.
Or were they generalized foragers,
Hmm.
meaning eating whatever's in the landscape,
Hmm.
and not being mammal focused? And it's been a rather hot debate going on, and people will point to the fact that well, there are half a dozen rabbits in this site along with a mammoth, and therefore people were eating more rabbits than they were mammoth.
Hmm.
It's gone to that level, uh, and not taking into account the fact that a mammoth is a whole lot bigger than a bunny.
Hmm.
Um,
And
but
I suppose there's naturally an
and
issue
part of that
here.
argument, well, part of the argument had to do with were the earliest peoples into the Americas likely to have a major impact on populations of megafauna?
Mm.
Were they in part responsible or largely responsible for the extinction of those megafauna so rapidly at the end of the Pleistocene? And
And
there are those
there's a
who
lot
don't
of
want to think
conflation.
that way.
There's a
Yeah.
lot of conflation too between the question of were Clovis megafaunal specialists and were they responsible for the overkill of 30 plus genera of taxa? Of course, those are different questions.
Right,
And so
right.
some might point to, hey, here's 12 taxa that never appear in Clovis records. So therefore, it's nothing but climate change. Humans had no role. So a lot of the debate really were different kinds of questions at different scales. But it is instructive to think about the debate. They use the same data. So often
Yeah.
you'll see the same tables of these materials
Same sites.
arguing for fundamentally different conclusions. It's quite entertaining to sort of from the Bringen record looking south and examining this debate.
Yeah, I mean it's inherently harder for people like you guys because you're studying deep history and right the records are very sparse. There's only so many bones you can find, and we're talking about stuff that happened a long time ago. I think it's worth mentioning even to listeners that this type of phenomenon happens in modern day bench science. You have the same exact data set, and you get these people from these lab say one thing, these people from this other lab say the other thing, and they're looking at the exact same data set. So oftentimes that's easy to overlook, especially when we pick up on topics that get picked up by the media. You can have two different people looking at the same exact data set, and they're both experts, and they come to completely different conclusions.
Yeah. Well, what we did in this case was um, there is in the archaeological record of North America only one individual directly associated with Clovis artifacts.
Hmm.
So we had only one person who was demonstrably Clovis. We have
Mm-hmm.
two others that are in the same age range, but no artifacts associated, and so we can't say whether or not Clovis was their cultural uh, identity. And that one individual was a 18-month-old child found in Welsall, Montana, known
Mm-hmm.
as the Anzac Boy, and he had died around 12,800 years ago, based on a direct radiocarbon dating of his bones. And at the time they ran the radiocarbon dates, the folks at Oxford also published a whole table of the stable isotope measurements that had been taken from the same bone protein that the date came from. But in a decade, nothing had been done with that.
Hmm.
And so two of our colleagues uh, Julie and Stu said, "Hey, maybe we could do a dietary analysis of this." And they came to me and to Ben about that. And Ben had recently been involved in a study on that from the Upward Sun River uh, children that he had excavated up there in Alaska. So we took that and went to find the animals of the ecosystem and get enough data on stable isotope composition of the proteins in those animals to be able to conduct the analysis. Now, the sort of the core of this is um, two of the major elements that are found in proteins, carbon and nitrogen, have two stable isotopes each. Carbon has carbon 13 and 12. Nitrogen has nitrogen 15 and nitrogen 14. And in growing plants and in ecosystems, the plants have, different groupings of plants have different proportions of these two isotopes in their tissues. Mm-hmm. And when animals eat those, they incorporate those differences and modify them slightly per trophic level. Mm-hmm. So there's a decrease or an increase in the concentration of nitrogen 15 and carbon 13 with each trophic step. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So as you go from first order consumers, the plant eaters, you get a single trophic shift. You go to the second order consumers, the eaters of the plant eaters, and you get another trophic step. Because of the differences in both their ecological niches and their digestive systems, these different animals end up with different proportions of carbon and nitrogen isotopes in their tissues. Mm-hmm. And we can take the pattern that we see among different species of animals, compare that to an individual or a species in question, and try and find out what its most likely diet was among the possible sources.
Okay, so if we imagine ourselves back in this time period, just like today, there's all sorts of different animals. They occupy different ecological niches. Some of them are plant eaters. Some of them eat the plant eaters. Some of them might even eat the things that eat the plant eaters, and so on and so forth. Depending on what an animal is eating, depending on how it's living in the environment, based on how it is, what it's consuming and how its digestive system is adapted to extract the nutrients from those food types, you get a different signature of isotopes of different kinds in those individuals. And so when you guys dig up and find remains from humans, mammoths, all sorts of other creatures, you can look at the pattern of isotopes present in that individual, and that will have a correspondence in terms of what that animal was eating. Was it a hypercarnivore? Was it an omnivore? Was it a plant eater, and so forth?
Yes, and in fact, we can find out which of the animals in the ecosystem were the most likely in its diet in their relative proportions.
But there's a couple of ways that we did this, and it's really intuitive. If you see an XY graph for this kind of research, you'll see carbon on the bottom, you'll see nitrogen on the side, and you're looking at dots. You're looking at points that represent individual animals that have been sampled for these variables. And they cluster, which is what we like to see. The horse are all clustering down here with really low nitrogen. Mammoth have much higher nitrogen. They're really separate. So you imagine these different cluster combinations on the map, and then you plug here's your individual, in this case, the diet of Anzac 1's mother. We're looking at maternal diet, which we can get into in a little bit. And it actually, very intuitively, in two-dimensional space, the closer the dot is to these other animals, the more likely they're incorporated into that tissue. And the second way we looked at this is through Bayesian modeling, where you're actually running statistical analyses to actually get a proportion, a mean and a standard deviation around what proportion of diet is being contributed by this taxon versus the other taxon. That's where we got the 35 to 40% of the protein diet is coming from mammoth specifically, higher than any of the other megafauna. And also that small mammals collectively only contributed 4% or less of the overall diet. And this, of course, stands in stark contrast to this model of Clovis as generalized foragers. The third way we did this was we looked at the secondary consumers, so the carnivores and omnivores. Here we're looking at where does the overall tissue of the maternal the Anzac one's mother, how does she lay out relative to these other animals that we understand their ecology? And interestingly, she was closest to Homotherium, which is scimitar cat, was a saber-toothed cat variety that we know was a juvenile mammoth specialist. So there's an independent line that says she's more like that than, say, a bear
Yeah.
or a wolf,
Yeah.
which is, more omnivorous
Yeah.
and then, using smaller prey.
Okay. So basically, to summarize all that, you can use radioisotope methodologies. You're looking at carbon and nitrogen
No,
isotopes.
not radioisotope,
Stable
stable
isotope.
isotope.
Stable isotopes. Okay, so you're looking at stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, and these things have a systematic relationship to an animal's ecology, what it's eating and the type of life it lives. You have samples from the past in this general place, in this general time, including this one human sample that we'll dig into, but a bunch of other animals, saber-toothed tigers, mammoths, small animals, a bunch of stuff. And you can sort of plot this stable isotope data out, and you get nice clean clustering, or there's an orderly relationship between what the animal was eating, the type of life it led, and where it falls on this map. And so then you can put the human sample on that and just ask, okay, does it look more like a saber-toothed cat? Does it look more like a mammoth? Does it look more like this, that, or the other animal? And that's gonna tell you something about what the human diet was. And the punchline that you just gave us was, when you do that type of analysis using these stable isotopes, the diet of this Clovis individual appears to be a lot like something like a saber-toothed cat, as opposed to something more omnivorous like a bear or some other type of creature.
Right, and it's definitely not an omnivore.
Mm.
An omnivore would appear, because it eats plants and animals in more or less equal proportions, like a bear,
Mm-hmm.
a black bear. It would appear between the hypercarnivores, like lions and saber-toothed cats, and the plant eaters, like
Mm-hmm.
horses and bison,
Yeah.
camel. And what happened with the Anzac child's mother is the Anzac child mother ended up next to that hypercarnivore scimitar cat,
Mm-hmm.
uh, nowhere near where a bear would be.
Mm-hmm.
So
And we know
definitely
independently.
not a generalized forager.
Yeah. So not only is it landing in the part of the graph where all the other carnivore data points are, but I think you guys mentioned that the saber-toothed cat, the closest point to the human sample, we know independently that this animal was specialized for mammoth consumption in particular.
Right.
Yeah, the morphology of the dentition is the key, and also the isotope signature. It maps on directly to mammoth. But I want to back up a little bit. That's we look at that as an additional line of evidence. Where do
Mm-hmm.
they map out with other secondary consumers? The most important, of course, is where does the diet plot out relative to the suites of animals that are in the area in the time period of question?
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, is the key issue. We can generate percentages for, again, heavy mammoth diet. There's a lot of elk, which is interesting. We don't see a lot of elk at the time, but that's because elk is coming into that region along with Clovis individuals from the north. It's a
Mm.
ringing animal, and we see them coming at roughly the same time. And we have elk antler at the Anzac site itself, so that's great independent confirmation that elk was a major component of the diet as well, as was bison and probably a little camel, but mostly bison as well. So basically, mammoth first, cervus or elk, then bison, and then horse was at a much lower level.
Mm-hmm. But they're
Horse,
killing they're killing big herbivores, and they're trying to get the most bang for their buck. So naturally, the mammoth is probably the most bang for their buck.
definitely the most bang for their buck. Yes, you could have the whole family, probably several families, if we take our indication from the Laprelle mammoth kill down in southern Wyoming, where they had three separate little camps around this one kill. So you could feed your entire community for a month, 2 months, whatever, on that one animal. So it's a lot of food as long as you
Mm-hmm.
keep it from spoiling.
And it's not just the protein; it's the fat. So, hunter
Yeah.
gatherers, that's one of the key nutrients that need to be getting enough fat in their diet. Super high energy rich resource, and of course, these are not going to be coming from plants. That can be coming
Right.
from animals, and particularly big animals. So, and I also want to stress that we're not saying they didn't eat plants. So they definitely ate plants. We have berries and this sort of thing. But as Jim mentioned, it's just not equivalent. It's not like something where it's a lot of plants.
Yeah.
Be typical for a generalist forager to be incorporated into their diet.
Yeah, they're not. They're not. They there's no evidence that they were eating what a modern person would intuitively call a balanced diet. They were probably eating a little bit of whatever they could, but they were indexing very, very, very high on the meat and the fat from these large-bodied herbivorous mammals.
They were eating a keto diet
Yeah, yeah, that's
or
where I
a
was going to go
carnivore
next.
diet in the modern dietary terminology.
Yeah, so most of their
And
energy was coming from fat rather than carbohydrate, presumably.
carbohydrates from fats and from protein. I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
your body can break down protein and turn it into energy as well.
Yeah.
In fact,
Yeah.
that's what it
A
does
good analog.
with your own body. If you run out of food, you're starting to feed on your own tissues.
Yeah, a good analog is when we, the question, one of the sort of the people on the other side would say is, oh, we don't really see a lot of foragers, just eating meat. And of course, the answer is, of course we do. You don't have to go very far for where I sit in Alaska. Inuit peoples and Paleo Inuit peoples regularly utilize majorly meat diets, either caribou or seal, whaling, walrus. That's the major component, and plants make up a much lower portion of the diet up here. So we certainly see plenty of evidence in the recent past of this kind of a diet. Of course, the animals are totally different in the
Yeah.
past.
Yeah. And of course, presumably people would have eaten things, season, like if berries are there for a part of the season, you can, presumably you're just, yeah, you're going to pluck some when they're there.
Yeah.
But the main food supply really did seem to be these big animals. And it is similar to what we see in more recent populations. It sounds like, for example, the Inuit, they're eating what's available season to season, but most of what's available most of the time are animals of different kinds.
Yeah, peoples of the Great Plains lived that way too.
Mm.
And they were getting the majority of their food supply
Hmm.
from bison fat and bison meat. They would pound it, dry it and pound it with berries, but the quantity of berries they were able to extract from their environment is probably nowhere near sufficient for to be a majority of their diet.
Yeah, and I had a gentleman named Eugene Morin, I think, on some months ago on the podcast, and we were talking about Paleolithic diets and things like that. And one thing he really emphasized is that in a lot of these populations, like the Inuit, yes, they're eating the meat, they're eating the protein, but they really, really prize the fat on the animal in a way that we often can't appreciate today. Like if I go to a restaurant with my family, a lot of people will cut the fat off their steak, but he's basically said, no, 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 no. In these settings back then, they wanted all of that fat. They really prized it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
if you're eating steak, you know the higher the fat content, the tastier it's going to be. That's part of human evolution. We really require that in the past, and we sought out all sorts of ways to get that.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah. I, Ben works in Alaska. He knows how much fat you want when you're working outdoors in Alaska. I spent one season up in the Aleutian Islands where it never stops raining and the wind never stops blowing and it doesn't get above 50 degrees most days. And we would practically fight over the foods with the most fat in them. So it's a big deal when you're needing to work with that. But you look at the keto diet that people go on, and they're keeping carbohydrates out of the diet. They're shifting to metabolizing fat, and they're seeking in some cases to metabolize their own fat. But their diet is predominantly protein and fat, and they do fine on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've learned recurrently in different ways on the podcast, talking to all sorts of different people, is that um, our body is very capable of switching between ketosis and glucose metabolism. We're essentially built for it, so to speak. There's a lot of evidence now that ketone bodies like BHB have various benefits, and basically the general inference that I make, and I think a lot of other people make, is that at least intermittently, peoples of the past were probably very commonly going into and potentially even staying in ketosis for extended periods of time, and so our body is in some sense adapted to it.
Right, right. I mean, clearly we're capable of shifting between the two. I think that probably the glucose metabolism basis might be a much more recent development in our
Yeah,
evolution.
as a consequence of agriculture,
And,
presumably.
and yes, post-agriculture.
Yeah.
I mean, where many of us aren't capable of digesting a lot of the materials that come out of grains.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, for example, particularly glucose, or not glucose,
Gluten?
Gluten.
gluten. Thank you. Gluten intolerant folks and lactose intolerant folks. I mean, there are people who aren't capable of digesting the materials that are commonly in our diets today. So, why would we expect that uh, our ancestors who didn't had yet not yet evolved the capability of using those nutrients weren't fundamentally different from ourselves in terms of their dietary needs?
Hmm. I want to ask you a little bit more about the individual you studied. So, where exactly was the sample taken from? And I think you mentioned that this was a child, a small child, 18-month-old. But when you're plotting the data, you're talking about the mother of the child. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah, the child was 18 months old. So, based on what we know about hunter-gatherer behavior, hunter-gatherers are usually nursing their children at least partially until they're 3.5 to 4 years old.
Hmm.
So and that's been found to be true among not only modern hunter-gatherers, but also ancient hunter-gatherer populations. It's not until you get into the Neolithic that you start seeing much younger weaning times
Mm-hmm.
in agricultural populations. So um, what we're reading actually is in large part the mother's body in looking at the child's
I see.
stabilizers,
Because
not
the
the
child would have
child's
been
body
getting most of its
himself,
food in the form of breast milk.
not his food supply. We're looking at her food supply.
Got it.
And given his age, we calculated that he was about one-third um, auxiliary foods and two-thirds mama,
Mm-hmm.
and computed on that basis. And what it showed was that N6 mom was heavy, heavy into the mammoth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so far and away, Mammoth was number one, and then the sort of the secondary, the second and third ranked things were other large-bodied mammals that you mentioned. So things like a bison and elk, I think you said.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
second.
96% of the protein diet was megafauna in some form or another. So I mean that by any stretch is a megafaunal specialist, and I think that's definitively demonstrated by this study. The secondary one sort of varies. Cervus is always high, so elk is always the second highest
Mm-hmm.
among the different models we did, which makes sense if we have multiple elk antler foreshafts that were found directly with the burial. And then bison was next. This matches broadly the faunal record, where bison were really common elements in these sort of these campsites, and horse was lower than the other ones. Horse was roughly 10% or so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess one, I mean, so on the one hand, your data is quite definitive in the sense that it's not very subtle. It's not like the data point was like in the middle and you can
It
kind of
was a
argue one.
hammer.
Yeah, it was pretty
Yeah,
clearly,
not
you know,
so.
the diet looked like a saber-toothed cat. It wasn't it wasn't even
Yeah.
like a bear. On the other hand, we're talking about one sample here. So how would people argue about that?
Well, it's important to take into account that when you take a random sample of a single member of any population, the probability is that that will be a normal individual, not a member of an extreme.
Mm-hmm.
This is the only individual we have. Consequently, it's the only data point we're going to get, at least unless we find a lot more people and modern sensibilities about ancient skeletons change. So it's the one we have.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to emphasize, I can't emphasize enough that you expect a single individual to be representative, not to be outside the norm.
Mm-hmm. And back then, the variance person to person was presumably much less, just because.
Much less. You would
Yeah,
expect
Yeah.
it to be much less. And considering the fact that Clovis looks the same everywhere you see it,
mm-hmm.
and that when you find food bone in Clovis sites, mammoth dominates.
Yeah. So it all
Bison
fits.
is secondary. We don't see elk very much because elk are not really widespread in the environment yet
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
at that time. They're still just moving it. They're just coming into the
Yeah.
country along with the
And,
people.
and that strikes me as informative in itself, because if elk are not that common there yet, and yet they show up as a highly ranked food here, that means that they were really focusing on them because they weren't just randomly sampling from whatever was available.
Well, they were getting them in their neighborhood. Elk was
Yes.
available in the fact that that was one of the strongest things about that finding was we had elk show up as a secondary food supply in
Hmm.
each of the tests we ran, and the elk antlers were with the child. I
Mm.
mean, those pieces, that set of evidence is like matching the scimitar cat in its quality of in its meaning
Hmm.
in the impact. Um, yeah, when you look at Clovis in general, the behavior is that of a highly mobile predator. And when we look at the sources of stone tool materials, you often find stone tools that come from sources hundreds of miles away.
Mm.
And we're not expecting that those tools are being used over years of time. They're probably being used more likely, 1 to 2 years or a month before you have to change out and get new ones.
Yeah, yeah. So
Or you can,
you not only have specialization to eat animals like this, but people are moving around a lot.
they're
So they
moving
are
around a
the
lot.
opposite of sedentary.
Exactly, exactly. They're not sedentary. So that high mobility um, is you take that high mobility and you look at the range of mobility of the mammoths that the team Ben's been working with has been looking at in Alaska. And not only that did they seem to move seasonally from place to place over large distances, sometimes they just shift completely and move to another landscape a
Hmm.
long distance away.
Mhm.
So if you have an animal that behaves that way, it's easy to see a human population that's been sort of migrating along with the mammoths, simply taking that great big leap and going off into a new landscape.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
everything about the record seems to say the same thing.
I really want to hit on that because I think that's there's been a very positive response to the article within the community. I think the only issue that I've seen raised is it's a sample size of one. Yeah, it seems to support our contention, but I want to look at it a couple different ways. So, one, this is the first test. This is the first direct test of these two ideas. So these are
Hmm.
the two competing ideas,
Yeah.
and unequivocally, rigorously, clearly, it came down on the side of the Clovis as a megafaunal specialist. It could have been the other way.
Yeah.
So the
Or
point
some
that
or
this
anywhere in the
is,
middle, right?
or
Mhm.
it could have been like a mushy middle. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fact that it came down so strongly with multiple lines of evidence, as we said, this is clear. This is rigorous and confirmed. The other issue, how far can we push this? Well, clearly, I mean, Jim highlighted some of these issues, but it bears sort of dialing down and looking at the details. So we understand hunter gatherers share food. This is one thing that we certainly understand about hunter gatherer ecology is that you're constantly sharing food. So the idea that this person would be an anomaly, something on the extreme, beyond the fact that it's randomly pulled from this
Yeah.
population,
Be
that's
very, very
also
unusual.
unlikely to be the case. Number one. The second issue that Jim mentioned, this homogeneous culture, this is a lifeway that's very much connected and tracked with moving with large mammal herds. You, and this is not just one site. This is many, many sites. This is dozens and dozens of sites where we see this relationship. And then the fauna remains really is the key. The fact that when they're preserved, this is proboscideans have the largest MNI, the minimum number of individuals we can track from these sites on the order of like in the 90s. This is a large amount of meat in a proportion. When you look at edible biomass, it dwarfs any of the other sort of elements in their diet, even if they were eating rabbit quite a bit. So this is really, we feel we can make rigorous inferences beyond this individual to Western Clovis as a whole.
Hmm. And I guess too, this also sort of this makes it very natural to intuitively reinterpret things that were fuzzier in the past. So for example, you've got all these Clovis sites that have been discovered over the years, and you find things like mammoth bones and rabbit bones and this, that, this, that, and the other artifact. And it sounds like people have argued over the years, okay, yeah, maybe you find a lot of mammoth bones, but maybe they weren't killing the mammoths. Maybe they just liked their bones and collected them for some other reason.
Yeah.
Maybe they were eating a lot of other stuff, but the bones didn't preserve or whatever. But now that you guys have this direct evidence from this isotope analysis, the fact that you find these mammoth bones so often at these Clovis sites, that means your interpretation really is like, no, they were eating them clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And also, if you take into account that the Anzic's mom, we're not just reading her diet the day before she
Mm,
nursed the child. this is not a one-off here.
Hmm.
You're looking at um, she is utilizing her stored tissues to feed the child.
Yeah.
She's using in part stored tissues, and she's using in part the food she's consuming day to day. And that protein is building up, has built up in her over many months to years, and she's transferring it to the child where it's building up over many months. And so we're not looking at a one-off diet or a single event diet or a big feast. We're looking at the diet over a long span of time.
Yeah. It's essentially showing you her average diet over some extended period of her life.
Right, right.
And the tissues from the child also formed over 18 months. So
Hmm.
this gives us a much bigger window and a more accurate window into diet than any one site could.
Hmm. And so the Clovis people, does this mean, so let's just assume that this result is solid and it generalizes. I buy the arguments that you guys are making, even though it's one sample. This is probably representative of the Clovis peoples in this general region at this time. Does this mean that that when we think about Native Americans, everyone who came after this period in North America, from the Iroquois to the Comanche to you name it, everything I learned about in grade school, are these people the descendants of the Clovis people? And does that mean that they're descended from this type of dietary culture?
Yes, it
Yeah.
does.
So, so the genetics is complicated. We don't have a ton of samples, and there's some regions where we don't have decent sample coverage. But broadly, it becomes complicated. It's simple and complicated at the same time. The simple thing is this: SNA is that clade that rapidly spread throughout the Americas and is directly ancestral to almost all, except for those in the far north.
Mhm.
That being said, there's sublineages that we can track and the geneticists have looked at. The Anzac child is one of those sublineages. There's other sublineages sort of much later in time, like maybe 10,000 years ago, that we see pop up in different regions. Of course, the issue is, how did those sublineages relate to each other? That's, from our perspective, not that much of an interest. The interest is that it was the single population that spread, and Clovis
Yeah.
is the earliest member of that group. So I think, yeah, as definitively as we can be in sort of paleoscience, we can say that, yeah, they're descended from these early hunter gatherers and around 13,000, 14,000 years ago that are coming in with this kind of an adaptation. So
Mhm.
it makes one, it's
Yeah,
so successful of a adaptation, and two, it led to very different sort of responses as people moved to different regions, as the climate shifted, as animals became extinct. Really fascinating sort of
Mhm.
process that occurred.
yeah.
Yeah.
Athabascan and Algonquian populations come from the northern North American clade, and they're not necessarily associated with Clovis as your culture descended from Clovis. So they may not descend from Clovis culture directly, but they probably also descend from populations that lived this way at some
Yeah.
point in their history in Beringia.
Hmm. Did you guys see that movie, that Martin Scorsese movie, Killers of the Flower Moon?
Not
I
yet.
know about it, but I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, this is just popping in my head. I saw it when it came out in theaters, but part of the um it's a historical movie about a certain time period after Europeans arrived, interacting with certain Native American populations. And one of the little motifs in the movie that I picked up on was that you had these very high rates of diabetes in Native American populations that were basically eating the food that the Europeans had brought over and stuff. And I wonder if there's some tie in to to this stuff. So like if you have if modern day Native Americans were descended from this population, and there's a long history there of eating what would essentially have been an animal based ketogenic diet. You might expect that those populations would have an especially tough time on a post agricultural diet that's high in bread and other things. I wonder if there's a connection there.
Well, the populations that lived on corn
Mm-hmm.
would have had a lot of glucose in their diets,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of simple starches in their diets, and may not be so profoundly affected by the modern day diet.
Mm-hmm.
But the populations that did not have that There's certainly an argument that they're more paleo kinds of diet,
Yeah.
we might say in modern dietary terms, uh, would not have so much of that simple carbohydrate in them, and therefore they're vulnerable to the consequences of a simple carbohydrate diet.
Yeah, yeah. And there's, I guess, the general thing that just applies to anyone anywhere, right? Like if you, like when you look at, some people have trouble with gluten and wheat products. Some people are lactose intolerant, like you mentioned. Different people have these different sensitivities, different types of foods. And I wonder if it has to do with the evolutionary history of your more direct descendants. So, like for example, I've never had a problem with bread and grains, but I also know that I can trace my lineage through to the first Neolithic farmers. So, there's probably a lot in my background of people that were used to eating those types of foods for a long time.
Yeah, if there's any genetic component that's going to be then traced through your ancestry and experience and evolution for sure.
There's a strong selective force when your population is trying to live off grains for gluten tolerance.
Hmm. Hmm.
If you're going to be what would probably be known as in the old days as a sickly child, they're probably sickly because they're incapable of digesting some of the major parts of the food supply,
Mm.
whether it be gluten or lactose in the milk. And when people have studied the distribution of the genes that provide lactose tolerance, those genes originate in areas like Northern Europe, where people were herding cattle for a major part of their diet
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and,
and
and
drinking
those
milk
genes spread
directly.
quite quickly, I believe.
Mhm.
Right. And in other parts of the world, East Asia, a lot of the population is glucose intolerant.
Hmm.
And the folks in Mongolia, they don't drink milk directly from the cow. They ferment it first.
Mm.
You make things like yogurt or uh, cheese
Hmm.
before you eat it,
Hmm.
because that makes it tolerable for you.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess in many ways, like based on what we've talked about, at least for some people in the world, the ketogenic diet has seen this resurgence recently, and it's become, one of the diets people are really excited about for different reasons. But in some sense, some people out there at least are maybe in a sense going back to their own ancestral diet when they think about something like a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, definitely. My wife has actually been trying that out and is encouraging me to because she finds she thinks more clearly
Hmm.
and has more energy at the end of the day,
Hmm.
which sounds good to me. So,
And I want to ask you too a little bit about it's been implied through much of our discussion so far, but what is the evidence exactly that the Clovis peoples were actively hunting the mammoths as opposed to say scavenging them?
Yeah, so I can say a couple of points on this. One, we haven't talked about sort of working with modern native groups and understanding their heritage, and I always was struck, and this came up in conversations with our colleagues, Shane Doyle and Sky Gillum, in the Montana area, that it's does a disservice to their heritage for people, archaeologists, to uh, opine that perhaps they didn't have the skills to take down some of these large megafauna, and nothing could be further from the truth. We have tons of evidence for very effective distance kill weapons like the spear thrower, the atlatl, and the dart technology. We have, one site in particular comes to mind, Lugovskoye site in Siberia, where you have a mammoth vertebrae with a hole in it and a microblade still stuck in it. You don't get more smoking gun than that. Um, we know that they're selecting from other megafaunal work that I've done, for instance, in the far north. They're selecting adult mammals with adult bison and elk, for instance, with the most fat reserve. So they're not going after
Mm.
animals that indicate that they could barely do it, or for Pete's sake, the scavenging argument may be suitable for like talking about Homo habilis, 2 million
yeah,
years ago in Africa, but not for modern humans.
Mhm.
Modern humans can and did take the largest prey that were available and the highest ranked. And yeah, I think, yeah, the folks that have argued that, and there have been a few of those, I think one argument I remember is, they maybe killed one mammoth and then talked about it the rest of their lives or something like that. That
Mhm.
really does a disservice to sort of the history and the heritage and the capabilities of these ancient
Mhm.
peoples that were so much like you and I today. That's my take on that.
Mhm.
Well, the evidence is in many of the kill sites, most of the kill sites, you not only have the skeleton of the animal, you also have projectile points, spear points that were lost in that mass of goo that was the decomposing leftovers of the kill.
Mm.
Um, you're not going to have that if all you're doing is cutting up a dead animal because the knife is always in your hand.
Right, right.
You're not going to be losing it. These are the points that remain with the carcass are ones that are literally lost among the skin and the offal and the huge bones that
Mhm.
into parts of the meat that you weren't able to get to before it spoiled, for example.
Mhm.
So you're just not going to see it. Plus, studies that have been done on the breakage patterns of the spear points and the resharpening patterns of the spear points are consistent with them being broken in use as a projectile, not as a knife.
Mhm. So they were using extensive use of projectile weapons. Was this spears, bows and arrows, all the above?
Not
So we
bows and
don't have,
arrows, just spears thrown with an atlatl, with a spear thrower, which adds a
Mm.
lever to your arm. So your
Yeah.
arm is one lever here, two levers here. You add another extension like that, and you've got much, much more. You can multiply your force significantly.
Hmm.
And you've got the heavy foreshafts on these spears made out of bone or antler or ivory, and the heavy stone spear point on the end. These were not small weapons. These are heavy
Yeah.
equipment that had a lot of kinetic energy when they struck.
Hmm.
and they're really only suitable for, as we look in the ethnographic record, suitable for taking down big game. And there's just a lot of independent lines of evidence that point to this. I don't think the scavenging idea has been taken seriously for decades now. There might be a few proponents, but broadly, the question always was what percent of the diet was it just every once in a while, and I think that's where 40% you're not getting from scavenging a few animals. You're getting that from selected, targeted, specific specialization.
Mhm. And so this study was this Clovis sample, and the Clovis culture eventually gave rise to all of the Native Americans in North America. So if we sort of go back and we go across, we cross back over to Eurasia. In this time period, do we think that this type of hunting culture and this type of essentially carnivorous diet was also common at the northern latitudes in Eurasia, and that
Yeah.
was part of what gave rise to present day Europeans?
So we actually do know quite a bit in the past, probably 5 years, probably more in the past 5 years, we've learned, particularly from the archaeogenetic data, than we learned sort of all previous times. So for instance, this ancient North Eurasian population, we understand that the Maltabor you may be familiar with, Yana, Afontova Garad, there's a number of individuals for this group that contributed about 30 to 40% of the genome into the Native Americans. So we know they're admixing with them in southern Siberia. So
Mm,
these guys were hanging out around Lake Baikal area or so. And we know genetically they're linked with early foragers in Europe. So early, it's connecting Eurasian populations. So we know these people are related to each other. The question, of course, is each individual group. You're going to need to look at the data like we're looking at it. So fauna remains are the main way people understand and model sort of ecology and the overall subsistence economy. And megafauna have been large contributors to a lot of these. So Aurignacian peoples, the very earliest modern humans, sort of expanding into Europe, have this. We can look at, say, early East Asians in northern China, Japan. They're subsisting on Paleoloxodon, which is another variant of an extinct proboscidean. The question is, I don't, from the Siberian data, I don't think we can say that they're only focused on mammoth. And I would say that the Clovis seem much more focused on mammoth, like as a proportion of the diet, than we see in Northeast Asia, where I mean, there's woolly rhino, there's horse, there's moose, there's a variety of megafauna, including mammoth. So I wouldn't say it depends on the site that you look at. So you can have sites like Berlioz, which seem to have, it's almost like an elephant graveyard. There's lots of mammoth. And then, of course, the issue is to what extent are these natural, death assemblages versus, kills? And the debates go back and forth. I think there's an argument that's pretty strong that at least some of these individuals were actively hunted by, Juktai peoples or other Northeast Asian cultures, but not to the extent that we see with Clovis. So that's what makes it interesting. With Clovis, this is a a more refined, a more limited specialization. Even though they're going after bison and elk and other animals, it seems more broad up in the north. Even with Swan Point, where we have mammoth, we also have horse. And a little bit later on, bison and elk are the dominant megafaunal species that are in these diets in the far north, even when there were still mammoth around.
Mm-hmm.
So there's variation, and the Clovis variant is now we can explicate.
Mm-hmm. Clovis folks probably took giant ground sloths and other megafauna as well. We just don't have any. We weren't able to find a record of giant ground sloth for the right time period. The giant ground sloth would be the Harlan's ground sloth, a grass-eating ground sloth, up in that part of Montana. We just don't have a record of that for that time period, so we couldn't check it. But should they encounter that animal, they're not likely to just leave it stand there.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
It's a big food package that can't run.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And we're talking about what these people ate, but of course there was lots of other predators around at this time that would have liked to eat those animals as well that humans would have essentially been competing with. Can you just give us some kind of sense for, as the Clovis culture is spreading and as some of these species fall prey to us and start to go extinct and the climate is changing, what did that faunal landscape look like? What kinds of animals were around, and what is sort of the pattern of extinction that we see as this human culture is spreading?
The extinction pretty much takes place. There's a study going on right now that I've gotten word of, and I can't really share what their findings are so far. It wouldn't be fair to them. But what we're seeing overall is that the extinctions are all taking place at around the same time.
And remind me, when is that exactly?
That they're taking place around the time of Clovis. From the last animals that have been dated, or the youngest animals that have been dated, range from the early end of Clovis to the end of Clovis.
Mm-hmm.
So sometime in that Clovis span is when most of these animals wink out, as far as we can tell from the dates that we have. The youngest direwolf I know is the one we dated in Texas. That's just shy of 13,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So mammoth, if you think of mammoth, like African elephants, it's a keystone species.
Yeah.
It actually modifies the environment it exists in extensively, creating niches for other kinds of animals. Mm-hmm. And so you take mammoth out of the system, you're going to have a significant impact on everything else. Not just the animals that prey on mammoths, but the others that rely on it for the disturbances it creates to produce their food supply.
Yeah.
So they're going to be secondary impacts. So we're going to have primary impacts of the humans killing the animals directly, and secondary impacts of the trickle-down effects of removing keystone animals.
And to address your question about the carnivores, I don't think with modern human behaviors there's really not a competition. Like if there's like in no way would we expect the carnivores to drive off humans if they just killed a mammoth, for instance.
Yeah,
so
but you can
it's
imagine
more
it going
about
in the
what they
other
would be
direction.
doing. It would be more about what they're doing to the population in other areas.
Yeah.
And what we can say broadly with the pattern of extinction is the carnivores are more delicate. There's fewer of them relative to herbivores, and some of them drop out early on in the record. So there is climate change effects broadly in the north, for instance. The lions go pretty quickly, even before humans are into the region. Cheetah, for instance, cheetahs also drop out pretty early. So this is American cheetah variant. But some that persist, as Jim mentioned, dire wolf lasts for a bit, and of course, gray wolf continue. Ursus, bear continues. But a lot of the cats go away early, so especially more specialized ones.
Well, the lion's still there.
Lion's still there, but a number
Our
of other
lion that
ones,
we used in our study was
yeah,
actually Clovis era. So yeah,
right. But a number of the lions aren't. So,
yeah,
we it is shifting, and we don't want to imply that humans are the 100% direct
Right.
cause of the
Things are
extinction of
shifting by the time all of this stuff is taking place. But then humans are
our
presumably a pretty big factor.
our point is that if you've already got animals under stress, if you already have
Yeah.
habitat reduction because of vegetation shifts at the end of the last ice age,
Yeah.
they become more susceptible to hunting pressure, particularly if there already is that specialization. I think that's one of the key takeaways is that for those arguing that it was only climate, these data really stand in stark contradiction to that kind of a model, and that we should be thinking more of humans playing a larger role in that. Um, but ultimately, one of the things to consider is it the human population was successful. They were able to successfully adapt to the changes that they found at the end of the last ice age and flourish.
Yeah.
One of the
Humans
other
didn't
take-home
disappear after
messages.
the last mammoth was gone.
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely not.
yeah. And another thing to consider there too is that, and I forgot what it was.
But I mean, it sounds like so the climate is already shifting, and then humans are this additional factor where, okay, now you've got the mammoth population and other large herbivore populations, they start to dwindle, which will have secondary impacts on other animals that are probably under a lot of ecological pressure already. And then, of course, this is happening over an extended span of time. And so as humans are in the area longer and longer, as they keep moving around and stuff, over time, naturally, they're going to pick up on all of the other stuff in the environment that they can utilize, and that eventually that just evolves into all of the other Native American populations that are specialized as foragers and other things.
Right. As they begin to settle into environments and not be moving around so frequently, they're going to experiment more with the local flora and fauna and
Mm-hmm.
learn how to use them effectively.
Mm-hmm.
But the point I was going to make that slipped my mind there is that we have multiple interglacials during the Pleistocene,
Mm.
multiple events. In fact, the last interglacial had a bigger temperature change than the present one has had until human beings have been fouling with it, with the fossil fuels. And yet, none of those genera went extinct, or at least we didn't have cascading, collapsing systems that we have in the post-Wisconsin. Uh, Given that the humans were probably the final straw in
Yeah.
a very unstable system.
Hmm.
But here we want to also be cautious of our individual sample that much
It's
more
not
work needs
telling
to
us.
be done.
Yeah,
And you mentioned ground sloth. I'd also make a pitch for mastodon. I mean, there are other parts of North America. We don't have mastodon in this region where Anzac was located, but we expect that would be another proboscidean that potentially could have been targeted, and Gomphotherium too further south. So this, I think, what we're trying to say is even though this is a single individual, there's lots of implications that can be derived from this research.
mhm.
And we're lucky in the sense that a lot has been written, a lot has been modeled with Clovis hypothesized as a megafauna specialist that really our data tie in with and makes those models much more plausible and more consistent with the evidence. The other models much more inconsistent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the other animals too, if you think about mastodons and gomphotheres, which in the case of the gomphotheres, we know that Clovis folks were killing them because there's a site
And what are those
with
exactly?
gomphotherium kills. Gomphotherium is another elephant,
I
another
see.
proboscidean, the small one, um, quite a bit, about 8 feet at the shoulder rather than 12 to 13 feet at the shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
And studies of mastodons and gomphotheres that have been done so far, not an extensive one on gomphotheres, but I have data of my own on my studies down in Mexico, um, show that these animals also moved over wide ranges. So, like mammoth, they were a wide-ranging species, and so if the human beings were emphasizing proboscideans in their hunting tactics, they're going to be likewise drawn into new ecosystems in areas that had those other in eastern North America and down south of the border into Mexico and Central America.
Hmm.
That's great that you mentioned that, Jim. I think the other element is it's not just diet. The fact that this is a megafauna specialized diet plays into lots of different other angles about the capacity for human foragers at the end of the last ice age, how they colonized the Americas so rapidly. It does tie into a lot of other kinds of interesting questions that for foragers, diet is the key. You start with how do you orient your entire culture around getting enough food? And in this case, plentiful, super abundant food really plays into all other aspects of your life.
Hmm. And I think there are maybe hints of this in some of the things that you mentioned, but if this type of lifestyle focused on this type of diet was so key for these people, are there any other artifacts that we have, any other findings, things that we find with the human remains, tools they're making, ornamentation that they're putting together that indicates that, following these animals around and utilizing them was part of their culture? Were they wearing antlers? Were they using parts of the animal for their clothing? Was it like incorporated into any of their cultural belief systems that we might have some indication of?
Well, certainly the foreshafts, the spear foreshafts that we find associated with Clovis, are typically made out of either mammoth bone or ivory, or in the case of Anzac, elk antler. So they're incorporating these animals into their technology.
Mhm.
Of course, that can be done off of dead animals and shed antlers, but uh, when you combine that with the evidence for diet and the evidence of direct kills and things like that, it would strongly suggest that these are animals that are animals that they're taking directly.
And you mentioned ideology and belief systems. That's so difficult to derive from these very ancient
Yeah.
populations. However, we do have some information on this. So it's interesting. My connection with Upward Sun River, and then the work that we did collectively at Anzac. Those are two very early burials of children at late Pleistocene period, and in both, hunting weapons are the items that were placed with these burials. At Upward Sun, we have two infants. We have a 6 week old and then a late stage neonate that were buried with ochre, just like Anzac, and with hunting weapons. In our case, they were big antler. They were also elk antler foreshafts with attached bifacial projectile points. Big enough certainly for big game. And of all the elements they could contribute in this sort of significant ritual oriented fashion, they chose the hunting weapons of the biggest animals.
Yeah.
I think that's relevant for
Yeah.
both
And
that
they
whatever
could have
other
used
things
them.
other things they were doing, that meant enough to them to be placing them in sort of sacrificial context. So they couldn't use those anymore.
Right, right.
These are items that were ready to be used, and they sacrificed them in the context of these burials, suggesting that their ideology probably had a strong component towards the importance and significance of these megafauna.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and in the case of Anzac, it was 100 tools, including 9 antler foreshafts, a tremendous amount of product that you're, as Ben said, sacrificing with this child that you're burying. It's something very important that you're giving up.
Hmm. And when I think about, I'm trying to piece together different parts of the evolutionary timeline here. When was like, for example, corn domesticated in the Americas, and how long ago was that? How much time ago was that relative to how much time people would have been engaged in this type of diet and lifestyle?
The corn is kind of an open question. There have long been claims that it was domesticated in the Tehuacan Valley in upland Mexico over 7,000 years ago.
Hmm.
More recent arguments suggest it was not quite that early. I'm not completely current with
Hmm.
what the thinking is on that, but
Several
you
thousand
don't
years ago.
see the
Several
impact.
thousand years.
Yeah, 4,000 years is more likely. You don't see the impact of it on um, stable isotope composition of human bones in that region until much, much later than
Hmm.
7,000 years. So 4,000
Yeah,
is when the cultures start developing
I
based on
see. And it takes some time to ramp up and spread and
it
become
takes
more and
them
more
a while.
significant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So probably for tens of thousands of years, people were eating a lot of mammoth and similar things. And then for
Well,
several thousand years, some of them
it,
We're engaged in
it's
farming and stuff.
In North America, south of the glacial ice, people who only had access to mammoths for a few hundred years,
Oh, okay.
no more
yeah.
than about
So
700 years. It's at current dating.
yeah, you're thinking like I think he's thinking broadly about Eurasia and
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
modern
yeah.
humans
Adding
expanding.
Eurasia in, that's another story. Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah,
it's a
I think
long time.
yeah, I think it's into yeah, as you say, evolutionary sort of history, and there we have to be careful with sort of pre-modern humans like Homo erectus, for instance.
Yeah.
They tend to be in the same low latitude sort of area where you can kind of transfer knowledge east-west. And from for instance, Neanderthal DNA data, it does suggest that these weren't very large populations. They were susceptible to lineage extinctions, for instance, and inbreeding, things like that. So early modern, it's hard to even compute and contrast with modern humans. But
Hmm.
what we can say with modern humans is, as Jim said, as you go further north, your resource opportunities are more limited, particularly on the plant side.
Yeah.
So you have less on the one hand, you have less plants, you have less biomass, fewer animals as you go further north, and the ecosystems become simpler, but also they become more seasonal. So it
Yep.
becomes you really need to gear your life ways to seasonal overabundances and movement. And one of the things that sort of focus on big game can do is you can kind of avoid that. You know, if you're following the animals on their seasonal movements,
Right.
then you don't necessarily have to shift and okay, now I need to focus on, I don't know, sheep as they come down in the winter, or on salmon that might be abundant in a very limited amount of time. And we don't really see those kind of adaptations until much later in the later stages of the ice age and the early Holocene. I guess you're to answer your question that way, there is a close relationship. This is a sort of an established, understood sort of life way. The question is in the details. Which
Hmm.
species were
Hmm.
important? And if you've got a snapshot here or there, they might give you different snapshots of what might happen that weekend,
Right.
14,000 years ago at this site. But it's really rare to get this quality of data. So Upward Sun, we've got it at Anzic. We have it now, and the many previous studies looking at isotopes are kind of maybe misleading because you a lot of people just focus on whatever natural animal populations might be there now because that's low hanging fruit. You can just go out and get their isotope data, right?
Hmm.
What we did with Anzic is really carefully try to curate the animals from that period, from that region, because isotope ecologies are going to shift. The baselines are going to shift through time. We know that. So some of these earlier studies, like for instance, the Chukaka individual in Alaska, 10,000 years old, the argument, oh, this is marine mammal. They're coastal adapted. There's a very strong component, and of course, this could be just salmon fishing, which is not. You can fish for salmon, quite far deep inland. It doesn't mean that you're going after sea mammals, and that's an example of maybe quickly quickly jumping to a conclusion based on modern data. And you really need to look at the ancient ecosystem, which is much harder to do. You need a lot more data.
What what's sort of next for understanding of the Clovis peoples and what was going on at this time? Are you guys digging up new fossil samples? Are there new ancient genome sequences coming out? What's on the horizon here?
Well, we're not seeing new ancient genomes coming out. There tends to be a lot of political constraint on that possibility these days. Even some of the genomes that have been extracted have not been published for over political concerns.
Hmm.
So I wouldn't expect too much of that coming out of the English-speaking North America, perhaps out of South America, if we can get individuals who are well enough preserved that the protein remains and the DNA remains. Um, but right now, I'm working on an individual from the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico who is of Clovis age, and trying to explore her diet by means other than stable isotopes because her protein is gone. It's the tropics and the bacteria that consume the protein fairly readily in the tropics. And so
Mm.
we don't have any protein available there, but we do have growth patterns in her bones that are hinting at a similar diet as we see with the Anzac child. And one of my motivations for working with the Anzac child was to um, help with the interpretation of this other individual.
And for
So,
for me, the research that we're actively engaged in, my research group here in Alaska, is we're really we have a lot of sites, a lot of well stratified sites with a lot of good preservation. And so we've been developing models to look at the exact nature of climate change over the last 20,000 years, looking at what's happening in the biotic community, the mammal community, and then when humans come into the mix, what are the effects of sort of human hunting pressure and the relationship, that complex interrelationship between climate change, vegetation shifts, and what humans are bringing to the mix and the changing strategies of humans through time in a way to try to get at sort of push-pull factors, which, we want to understand, why did humans come into the Americas at the time that they did? Why not earlier? They certainly, we have the presence of the Yana individual 33,000 years ago and about as far north as you can get in Asia. So why didn't they come across then? There's all sorts of questions about timing and adaptive strategies that we're engaged in actively in the far north, and it bears directly on sort of the Clovis phenomenon.
33,000 was an interstadial. So,
That's my I'm running with that model at this
yeah,
point. It
yeah,
seems to be connected with later groups that are in the Baikal area. It just happens to be the earliest dated one.
yeah,
So I expect it sort of contracted. But
yeah.
if there were people at White Sands 22,000 years ago, I suspect that it may have something to do with that ancient North Eurasian population. And as such, we know when they're admixing with Native Americans, and it's much, much later in time.
Yeah.
Hmm. And so just remind me of a couple of details here. So by the time the Clovis culture is really spreading in the Americas, had people already made it from Eurasia all the way into Western Europe, or what was sort of the extent of human occupation on that part of the world?
Oh, people are into Western Europe by around 43,000 years ago.
Okay. And that's
So
roughly kind of
much,
when the
much
Neanderthals
earlier.
disappear and stuff like that.
Yeah, the Neanderthals appear just about the time we see widespread Homo sapiens sapiens in Europe.
Hmm.
Um, the spread across the southern part of Eurasia takes place earlier, somewhere
Hmm.
on the between sometime during 50 to 60,000 years ago or so. They're moving across the south,
Hmm.
and then they expand into um, the Arctic or subarctic regions about the same time they're moving in other subarctic regions about the same time they're moving into Europe.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it
So,
makes sense that they're sort of spreading into these colder, more hospitable regions later because it's just
yeah,
harder to live and move there.
yeah, they
and
got
and
it
also
covered
altitude.
now.
And it's also altitude, like the Tibetan Plateau. We also don't see humans sort of going higher in elevation until later in time. And
Mm.
some of it could be population pressure, things like that, better technologies. But it's the same kind of an idea. Higher latitudes and higher altitudes all have less. It's not so much they have less resources, but they do have overall less biomass. It's harder to get at if we're evolved and well adapted for mid-latitude environments, temperate environments.
Hmm. Hmm. Is there anything you guys want to reiterate that we talked about, or anything you want to just sort of say again, given how much ground we covered?
Well, just to emphasize that our finding may be of a single individual, but it is supported by all other lines of evidence that we see about Clovis itself.
Hmm.
That they were a wide-ranging population that moved very frequently from place to place, that they're typically associated with large mammal remains, that artifacts are, that mammoth does tend to dominate those animal assemblages, so that what we're finding um, with this actual single episode of direct evidence about the diet of the Clovis people is supported by all those other lines of evidence. It is corroborated by them rather than the other way around.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think for me, but we covered a lot in good detail and in good depth. So I appreciate the very good questions for us. I think just maybe reemphasizing sort of the collaborative nature of what we've done. That early on, we sought out, we talked with Sarah Anzik, the landowner, the person responsible for a lot of the earlier work or allowing a lot of the earlier work. We wanted to reach out, and we did reach out to indigenous peoples in the region to foster a very positive relationship. Like, what's the interest? How are you? Are there any concerns with the work that we're doing? I think the fact that we're able to do this without more destructive analysis of the remains, which have been reburied since 2014, was a major point that people were happy with. And of course, and this parallels what I found up in the far north. Indigenous peoples, of course, want to understand their heritage, and diet is one thing that brings the ancient ones and modern peoples together. The subsistence issues are a paramount interest to a lot of Native Americans today, and if we can contribute in some way to understanding the antiquity of some of these lifeways and how, for instance, the fact that that people in that region for millennia have gone after the biggest animals that are on the landscape, and of course they can effectively do that, and they did do that. That's been a great experience for me and us broadly on this project, is that we're doing this ethically. We're going through this in a way that can be beneficial to everybody involved.
All right, Professor Ben Potter, Jim Chatters, thank you very much for your time. This is fascinating work.
Thank you.
Yeah, been fun.
Hey everyone, I want to share with you a new AI-powered research tool I've been using to find scientific papers and learn from the literature. It's called Consensus. It is an AI-powered search tool built using large language models trained to help you find and understand the best science faster. Consensus helps you not only find individual papers, but its AI models will help you assess research quality and even synthesize insights across multiple papers for you. You can ask it general questions about any topic you might have, such as what are the known risks and benefits of a certain prescription drug? What do we know about how a certain food or nutrient affects the human body? Anything you can think of. Its pro analysis feature will actually provide you with a concise written summary of what the literature says, broken down point by point, highlighting the strength of the evidence across papers and providing you with individual studies ranked by the relevance and including additional information like citation rates, journal quality, and more. You can also save, cite, and share individual studies with a single click. Unlike other AI and search tools like ChatGPT, PubMed, or Google Scholar, Consensus uses over 20 custom large language models that are developed and trained for this specific purpose. The base Consensus product is totally free, but the premium product that you can subscribe to has better features and unlimited queries. And I highly recommend this if you are using outdated tools like PubMed or Google Scholar, or you just do your own research. For a limited time, you can use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL, all one word, to get a free premium subscription for 1 year. That is a $150 value for free if you use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL today. So click the link in the episode description or check my support page and give Consensus a try. Use the code MINDMATTERSPECIAL to unlock your free premium subscription today.